Shalom, shalom. So welcome to Beth Ariel congregation. Welcome also to those who are following us through Facebook and YouTube. We have a treat for you today. And welcome to those who are listening on the radio here in Montreal, in different cities in the US, and also in Israel. As you probably know, the Saturday messages are aired every day, 6 days a week, through Israel and the neighboring countries. You know, we've received many emails of people who are blessed, and I want to tell you that all this is possible because we're working as one body, right? Working as one body. You know, before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to tell you about a beautiful story which deeply, deeply touched my heart. You know, it's about this family, father, mother, and 3 children who came to believe in Yeshua through Yuri, the leader of our Spanish ministry. You know, among the children is a young 11-year-old girl with stage 4 cancer. You know, Yuri tells me that he had them in his heart, and he prayed. He prayed at least for a month and a half to have an open door so he could meet the family, so he can tell them about Yeshua. And one day he met the father out of the blue at a soccer game, and the father actually invited him to come home. So he went home and he brought them to a saving knowledge of Yeshua. You know, he read to them Romans 10:9, you know, that if you confess with your mouth, okay, Jesus as Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. They understood, and they prayed the prayer, and they asked, they said, how come we never knew about this? How come we went to this church? I mean, it was, of course, another type of church, you know, and never told us about it. And so this is great, by the way. This is why we're here, right? In order to preach the word of God, because in heaven you can do that. Why? No sinners in heaven. And so this morning we are privileged to have with us Dr. Fruchtenbaum, a longtime friend of Beth Ariel, as our guest speaker. Dr. Fruchtenbaum is an international speaker and author of many books. Many of them we have in the mezzanine. Okay, so these books deal with different subjects of the scriptures and always with a Jewish perspective. And one of these books, which I love and which I suggest, is his doctorate dissertation called Israelology, which carefully outlines the place of Israel yesterday, today, and in the future, a much needed information today. As we've often mentioned from this pulpit, there's a growing, shoveway of Israel into this Christianity, with the idea that the church has replaced Israel. It's growing. It's growing. Has God forsaken Israel? Has God forgotten Israel? The Bible is clear on this matter, and this is part of the subject Dr. Fruchtenbaum will bring to us. The title is Salvation from Israel to the Gentiles, from Israel to the whole world. This study will bring us back to the roots, to the scriptures where it all began. We look into key passages concerning the history of salvation, and it will answer questions like, how were the Gentiles saved before the birth of the church in Acts chapter 2? It will show the close relationship as well between Israel and her sister, the church, and will especially show that Israel has an important place in the plan of God, in the future plan of God. And so I will call Dr. Fruchtenbaum to come up, and of course after the expose, we will have a period of questions and answer. So let's welcome Dr. Fruchtenbaum.
It's on.
It's on.
Okay, I hope everybody has a copy of the outline, either English or French. Anyone not have a copy of this, just raise your hand real quick. A few hands are up. We can get the ushers to pass the outlines out to them, please. On top of your outline is the main theme, salvation from Israel to the nations, from Israel to the Gentiles. And what we'll be doing is, in the course of this study, is to answer the question, why is God saving Gentiles today? It's not a burning issue in the church today, but in the first century among the Jewish believers, it was a real big issue. because when the Ecclesia, the Keilah began, it was began among the Jewish people, accepted Yeshua as their Messiah. But about 10, 15 years of the history of the Keilah, the Ecclesia, the church, it was virtually all Jewish. The only Gentiles, there were parts of it, the Gentiles that previously converted to Mosaic Judaism, and then also became believers in Yeshua thereafter. It changed a bit in Acts chapter 8 when the gospel went out to the Samaritans. That caused a bit of a stir, not a big one, because the Samaritans did have Jewish origins. It began to change in chapter 10 when Peter presented the gospel for the first time to uncircumcised Gentiles. And chapter 11, when he came back to Jerusalem, he was actually verbally attacked by the fellow members of his congregation in Jerusalem, why he would give them the gospel, why he would sit with them thereafter and actually eat with them from the same tables. And it took a while for the Messianic community of the first century to fully understand that the gospel will not be limited to Jews and proselytes to Judaism, but to a much wider world. Now, in the passage that was referenced during the song service, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8 and 9, Deuteronomy 32, verse 8 and 9, the God has an overall prophetic program. It's a program we often subdivide into three distinct plans, in that God has a plan for Israel, He has a plan for the church, He has a plan for the Gentile nations. But all three of God's plans of His overall prophetic program center around the Jewish people. To the extent that Moses writes that when God providentially laid down or become the borders of various nations, that was somehow based upon the number of Jews that play a role in that nation's history. And therefore, God has a plan for Gentile salvation. This must be somehow relevant to His plan and program for the Jewish people. And so as we deal with how the gospel moves from Israel to the nations, we're going to answer the question, why did God do so? What is the reason for Gentile salvation? And the first major reason is to take up from the Gentiles a people for His name. Take up the Gentiles a people for His name. Look at Acts 15, verse 13. Acts 15, verse 13. After they had held their peace, James answered, saying, Brethren, hearken unto me. Simeon had rehearsed how God first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for His name. And to this agreed the words of the prophets, as it is written, For these things, after these things I will return and build again the tabernacle of David, which has fallen. I will build again the ruins thereof, and the residue of the men may seek after the Lord. And all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, says the Lord who makes these things known from of old. And so one reason for Gentile salvation is to take up among the Gentiles a people for His name. And your outline in capital A, notice the situation before Acts 2. Before Acts 2, you have primarily God working with and through the people of Israel. And already from the time of Elijah the prophet, there was a distinction between two Israels. First of all, there was Israel the whole, all Jews who were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Within the larger Israel was a small Israel called the remnant of Israel, and these are the Jews that were true believers. And it was in the minority. So in Elijah's day, there was somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million Jews in the northern kingdom, only a mere 7,000 were really believers. And sometimes the remnant was small, sometimes the remnant was large, but it was never the majority in the course of Israel's history. And Isaiah pointed out that in his day, what distinguished the remnant from the non-remnant is what they believed in Moses and the prophets. And the remnant was those who accepted the words of the Moses and the prophets as the word of God. The non-remnant pursued idolatry and a number of different occultic type practices. And he also prophesied in chapter 8 of his book that when Emmanuel, which he prophesied in chapter 7, will arrive, he will become the new point of division between the remnant and the non-remnant. And the remnant will be those who accept the Messiah. The non-remnant will reject him. And that's what happens in the period of the Gospels into the book of Acts. But now, so God has always had a select group of Jews that were members of the remnant, but now God has a similar group among the Gentiles. And now there'll be a select group of Gentiles who are not previously proselytes to Judaism, Gentiles in their uncircumcision, that now become a people for his name. A people for his name. And you put the remnant of Israel, the Jewish believers, the people for his name, the Gentile believers into one, that is the body of the Messiah. And that is the congregation, that is the Keilah, that is the church. Now this whole plan of God's program surprised many of the early Jewish believers, but had they had a better knowledge of what God told in the Hebrew Bible, it should not have caught them quite by surprise. For example, turn to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12. And in dealing with the making of the Abrahamic covenant in verses 1, 2, and 3, the last phrase of verse 3 says, "In you shall all the families of the earth be blessed." In you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And Abrahamic covenant and the other Jewish covenants contain both physical promises and provisions and spiritual promises and provisions. And while the physical promises, like the promise of the land, would be limited to the Jewish people, the spiritual blessings will extend to the Gentiles. And so at some point, this was going to be the reality. Now, how is that going to come about? Look at Isaiah chapter 42. Isaiah chapter 42. And look at verse 1. Isaiah chapter 42, verse 1. "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit within him, and he shall bring forth justice to the Gentiles." Skipping down to verse 6. "I, Jehovah, have called you in righteousness, and will hold your hand. I will keep you and give you for a covenant of the people and for a light of the Gentiles." And here Isaiah reveals that the Messianic mission would include two different groups, both Jews and Gentiles. And for the Jewish people, he will be the one that will fulfill the Jewish covenants. So he says, for a covenant of the people, singular, for a covenant of the people, because this one will fulfill all of the promises and blessings given to Israel prophetically to be fulfilled as part of Messiah's messianic mission. And then secondly, also be the light to the Gentiles. What this verse does not tell us is this: will he be both the covenant of the people and light to the Gentiles simultaneously, or will this be a sequential element, a chronological element? And that's answered later in chapter 49. Chapter 49 of Isaiah. In chapter 49, verses 1 through 4, he pictures the Messiah as being in a state of discouragement because of Israel's rejection of his messiahship, which might imply that his messianic mission ended in failure. But then he receives a message from God the Father, and in Luke's account of Gethsemane, this came by means of an angel. And verse 5 says, "And now says Jehovah, that formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob again to him, and Israel may be gathered unto him. For honorable in the eyes of Jehovah, my God has become my strength. Yea, he said, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give you for light to the Gentiles, that you may be my salvation unto the ends of the earth." And the message to the Messiah in his agony is that the Israel's rejection of his messianic claims did not catch God by surprise. It was already revealed to happen. It was always part of the divine plan. So when he comes, he'll be rejected by Israel, and as a result, he'll become the light to the Gentiles, that you may be my salvation unto the ends of the earth. And when the apostles are given the geographical division of their spread to share the gospel, he mentions geographically three names: Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. He does not say the Gentiles, but he says that you may be my witnesses unto the ends of the earth. And that was already a Hebrew idiom you can see here in verse 6 to refer to the Gentile world. Let the Gentiles, that you may be my salvation unto the ends of the earth. So now we see that the twofold program is sequential, chronological, not simultaneously. He will first be the light to the Gentiles for a period of Gentile salvation. And when that program is complete, then he will fulfill the second facet. And verse 8 says, "Thus says Jehovah, in an acceptable time have I answered you. In the day of salvation have I helped you. I will preserve you and give you for a covenant of the people, to raise up the land and to make them inherit the heritages." And here we learn that becoming a covenant of the people, while the covenantal promises will be fulfilled, will follow the period of the light to the Gentiles. Only after Israel becomes a believing nation will these things be fulfilled. So at that point, God will restore the land to the people, and he'll bring the people to the land. And the passage is also quoted in the passage we read in James. Now this passage, Amos chapter 9, verse 11 and 12, says to make point, Gentile salvation was always part of God's plan, and therefore is quoted by James in the Acts 15 passage. So we come now to the book of Romans chapter 9. Book of Romans chapter 9. What Paul is saying here is that was prophesied to happen now has happened. And in chapter 9 of Romans, verses 1 through 23, Israel's rejection did not catch God by surprise. It was part of God's revealed and divine will, divine plan. And so what has happened more recently in the case of Yeshua has now been fulfillment of exactly what God said. But then he points out in Romans 9, verses 24 through 33, as the calling of the Gentiles have also begun. So verse 24, even us whom he called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. And it goes on to quote from the book of Hosea to show this was already part of the divine plan. And so the calling of Gentiles has now begun in earnest. As he points out, God is not merely the God of the Jews. He's also the God of the Gentiles. As the God of the Jews, he would have a program of Jewish salvation, but at the same token, as the God of the Gentiles, he has a program for Gentile salvation. And this should have been anticipated in light of what had been revealed in the Hebrew Bible. And by the time Romans was written, there were already more believers outside the land. There were more believers among the Gentiles than among the Jews. And that led to capital D on your outline, the position of these Gentile believers. And now let's turn to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2. Because of the influence of two key early church fathers, you had the rise and conquest of replacement theology. The first, the church writings we have extant from 2nd and 3rd and the beginnings of the 4th century. It clearly shows that the early church was premillennial, believing the Messiah comes back, he will set up a messianic kingdom. They were not so clear as to Israel's role in that kingdom, but they definitely believed in a clearly messianic kingdom. That began to change with two men. First of all, Origen, who introduced the allegorical method of interpretation. And what was important to him is not the obvious teaching of the text, or more hidden spiritual meaning. He applied that system to the whole Bible, including the historical segments. Then came Augustine, who took that method and applied it to the issue of Bible prophecy, especially in the area of eschatology and Israelology. And he invented a new view that did not exist previously, which is called amillennialism, in that there's no literal millennium. The millennium is simply a symbolic number between the first and second coming, and therefore we are now in the millennium. They do believe in a second coming, but the second coming will mark the end of the world, will not bring about any future kingdom, and less so a future restoration of Israel. We're already now living in the millennium. And coming from a Jewish perspective, which I tend to do, if this is the millennium, we must be in the slum section of the millennium. This is the Messianic kingdom. It's not as nice as the Bible describes it. And it's still the dominant position in the church today, and as Jacques mentioned, it is growing. It is growing. And so rise of more anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and so on, to the whole net program, and it's amazing how many people are being swept into it. So in their view, the position of the Gentiles is that God has given the covenants to the church, and the Gentiles of the church. And now the covenants belong to the church and not to Israel. So look at Ephesians Chapter 2, verse 11. Wherefore remember that once ye the Gentiles in the flesh, you are called uncircumcision, by that which is called circumcision in the flesh made by hands, that you at that time separate from Messiah, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of the promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Messiah Yeshua, ye that were once far off are made nigh in the blood of Messiah. For is our peace, and made both one, and broke down the middle wall of partition, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, that he might create himself of the two one new man, and so making peace, and might reconcile them both into one body through God, unto God through the cross, the having slain the enmity thereby. He begins this paragraph pointing out that there are two ethnic groups originally, Jews and Gentiles. And the advantage of the Jewish ethnic identity in verse 12 is that God had a covenantal relationship with the Jewish people. Notice the word covenant is plural, because God made 4 eternal and unconditional covenants with the Jewish people. And we call these covenants today the Abrahamic covenant, the land covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. And God's blessings, both physical and spiritual, are mediated by means of these 4 covenants. But also, he points out God made another covenant with Israel, which was distinct from the other 4. The Mosaic covenant containing the Torah, the 613 commandments of Mosaic law. And this was distinct in that this was conditional and this was temporary. And while there are a number of different purposes for the Torah, the law, the one he points out here is there was a serve as a middle wall of partition to keep Gentiles as Gentiles away from enjoying the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. Therefore, he points out there were 2 things in connection with the covenants. They were strangers to the covenants, had no right to receive any benefits. And secondly, they were far off, too far away to receive the benefits. When Messiah died, he broke down the middle wall of partition, which was the Mosaic law. And notice at the end of verse 15, to create in himself of the 2. What 2 in this context? Jews and Gentiles. One new man. And now we have a 3rd new entity that did not exist previously. An entity that is a combination of both Jews and Gentiles who believe. He says in verse 16, this one new man is the body, and the body of the Messiah comprises all Jews who believe and all Gentiles who believe, united into one body. You have Israel, you have the Gentiles, but you also have the body of the Messiah, which contains believers from both groups. Now skip down to chapter 3, verse 6. Chapter 3, verse 6. The Gentiles are fellow heirs, fellow members of the body, and fellow partakers of the promise in Messiah Yeshua through the gospel. And notice Gentiles have become, and the key word Paul will use here in two other important passages is the term partaker. Gentile believers have now become partakers of the spiritual promises, blessings of the Jewish covenants. And notice what he does not say. He does not say they have become taker-overs, the point of replacement theology, but partakers of these Jewish spiritual blessings. And so the Gentiles now receive the benefits of this blessing. Now turn to another passage that uses that term, Romans 11. In verses 15 through 24, Paul gives his famous illustration of the olive tree. The olive tree does not represent Israel. Israel is represented by the natural branches. Nor is the olive tree the church of the Gentiles represented by the wild olive branches. Rather, the olive tree represents the place of the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. And he points out the two different kinds of branches enjoying the benefits of this tree. Look at verse 17. But some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, was grafted in among them, and did become partaker. That's the key word again. Become a partaker with them, the natural branches, the Jewish believers, of the root of the fatness of the olive tree. And notice the wild olive branches representing the Gentile believers, and the natural branches representing the Jewish believers are now are in the tree. One is naturally of the tree, one is grafted into the tree, enjoying the sap, the blessings of the olive tree. But to whom does the olive tree belong? Now skip down in verse 24. Verse 24, if you were cut out of that which is by nature a wild olive tree, and was grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these which are the natural branches be grafted into, those two possessive pronouns, their own olive tree? The tree does not belong to the wild olive branches, but to natural branches. That's why the tree cannot be Israel. Israel is the owner of the tree. And what is owned and what the thing itself is are two different things. For example, I own a car. The car and I are two different things, but I am the owner of the car. And if I give you a ride in my car from one city to another city, you are partaking of the benefits of my car, but my car still belongs to me. By the same token, the wild olive branches are partaking of the spiritual blessings of the olive tree, but did not become the owners of the tree. The tree belongs to Israel. And so Israel is distinct from the tree as being the owner of the tree, and the tree represents the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. Now, in light of this, he builds on this. In chapter 15, we have the third use of the term partaker. Chapter 15, look at verse 25, Romans 15:25. But now I say, I go unto Jerusalem, ministering unto the saints. For it had been the good pleasure of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints that are at Jerusalem. So far, he's told us he's been traveling among the Gentile Greek-speaking churches, collecting funds for the church of Jerusalem, which have gone into poverty. Now, is this merely a goodwill gesture? Is this merely showing, say, Christian love? No, there's a specific biblical theological issue. Now look at verse 27. Yea, it had been their good pleasure, and there as they are. For the Gentiles have been made partakers, there's our third use of the term, made partakers of their spiritual things. They owe to them to minister unto them in material things. There's the contrast between the spiritual and the material. The Gentile believers are partaking of the spiritual promises and blessings of the Jewish covenants. Not the physical, but the spiritual. But the fact that Gentile believers are partaking of the spiritual blessings puts them into debt. So if you happen to be a Gentile believer in the audience, and you are a believer, you are now in debt. We don't tell you this when we first witness to you, we spring it onto you right about now. But also Paul points out how you can become debt-free, and that's sharing with the Jewish ministries in the material sense. So this, if I was to apply it to a local church, when the local church begins to map out their missions giving, they should find a Jewish ministry to support. And for individual matters as well, if they begin to map out their missions giving, they should find a Jewish ministry to support. And a very good one is right here in your local Messianic congregation in Beth Ariel Fellowship here, and that could be where you can target your giving. And but this is the way to pay off the obligation by sharing materially with Jewish ministries. Now, I'll turn back to chapter 11 of Romans. We saw from Isaiah's prophecy, chapter 49, there'll be a period of light to the Gentiles, but at some point he will deal with Israel till all Israel is saved. It is the same basic outline here. Verse 25 says, I would not have you ignorant, brethren, of this mystery, lest ye be wise in your own conceits. The hardening in part hath before Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, and so all Israel will be saved. And to prove that point, he quotes the promises of the new covenant. So he tells the Gentile believers in the Church of Rome, he does not want them to be ignorant about two things. First of all, that the hardening of Israel is partial, and because it's partial, there'll always be Jews coming to faith. But secondly, it's also temporary, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And the Greek word for fullness means a set number, and God has a set number of Gentiles he will bring into the body. He has now told us what that set number is, and therefore must continue to witness, to evangelize, to missionize until that set number is reached. Once that set number is reached, the body will be complete, be removed by means of the rapture, and then God will begin to deal with Israel until all Israel is saved. And there will someday be a national salvation of Israel. Sadly, some people misinterpret the verse that means eventually all Jews living in debt will come to be saved. There's no need to exercise Jewish ministries or missions today because all Jews will be saved. But he's not saying all Jews of all time will be saved. Rather, all Jews at a certain point of time will be saved. And that point of time is following the fullness of the Gentiles. And the background here is a passage in Zechariah chapter 13, verse 8 and 9, Zechariah 13, verse 8 and 9, that in the tribulation, 2/3 of our people will die in the persecutions, but the whole 1/3 that survives will all come to faith, fulfilling the prerequisite to the second coming, and therefore in chapter 14 of Zechariah it moves into a description of the second coming. But the all Israel shall be saved are the Jews who survive towards the end of the tribulation. And therefore, evangelizing witness to Jews is still as essential as it was in the first century. And furthermore, it should go out to the Jew first. So eventually, Israel, following the fullness of the Gentiles and following the rapture, it will ultimately lead to Israel's national salvation. The second reason, let's turn back to Romans 11. We'll look at Romans 11, verse 11. I say then, did they stumble that they might fall? God forbid. But by their fall, salvation has come unto Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy. Now if the fall is the riches of the world, and the loss the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you that are Gentiles, as much then as I'm an apostle of Gentiles, I glorify my ministry, lest by any means I may provoke to jealousy them that are my flesh, and may save some of them. He begins this section with the question, did they stumble that they might fall? Because in the end of chapter 9, he did write, Israel has stumbled over the messianic stone of stumble. But now the issue is, did they stumble to fall irrevocably, never to rise again? And the answer is, God forbid. That's not really a true rendering of the Greek. In Greek, this is the strongest possible way to say no, a strong Greek negation. Literally, may it never be. May it never be. Don't even think on it. If I was to give you a more literal rendering of the Greek text, it would be, are you out of your Vulcan minds? Such a thought is simply inconceivable, that they could fall and never to rise again. And the answer comes in the following verses. May it never be, perish the thought, because in light of God's faithfulness, this is unthinkable. And in the last part of verse 11, God planned for Israel to stumble, that salvation could go out to the Gentiles. But now it gives us the second purpose of Gentile salvation, to provoke Jews to jealousy. Gentile salvation was for the purpose of provoking the Jews to jealousy. Now notice the phrase to provoke to jealousy, that those four English words is only one word in Greek. It's on your outline, the capital parozilao. It's a combination of two Greek words. First of all, para, which means to come alongside of. Come alongside of. The second part is the Greek word zelos, and the root for zelos has the meaning of to flame, to seethe, to cause to burn, to make red hot. To flame, to seethe, to cause to burn, to make red hot. And it conveys three different meanings. Sometimes to be envious, sometimes to be zealous, or like here, sometimes to be jealous. And putting the two words together is what he's teaching. A Gentile believer comes alongside a Jewish unbeliever, para, and lives such a life and be such a consistent witness that the Jewish person begins to seethe with jealousy, begins to burn with jealousy, and finally says, what is this Gentile doing with my Jewish Messiah? And that ultimately will come to faith. And Sharon shared how a Gentile believer provoked her, and it was a Gentile believer also provoked me. In a survey taken some decades ago now among 30,000 Jewish believers in North America, one question was, did you come to faith through a Gentile or a Jew? And the vast majority said they came to faith through a Gentile believers that provoked them to jealousy. And so by means of Gentiles, the remnant of verses 1 through 10 will be coming to faith. Now, sadly in church history, the church has done more to provoke the Jews to anger than to jealousy. And the church largely failed to fulfill this function. But individual Gentiles have not failed. And still to this day, many Jews are coming to faith because they've been provoked by Gentiles who provoke them to jealousy. So in verse 12, he points out a contrast between the partial and the remnant, and partial and the fullness rather. The partial. Today, the believing element of Israel has been reduced to a small remnant. But this has brought spiritual riches to the Gentiles. When the fullness of Israel comes, when all Israel is saved, then there will be a national salvation, and this will result in even greater blessing for the Gentiles. It's an argument what we call from Calvin Homer, arguing from the lesser to the greater, that if Gentiles have received this much blessing because of Israel's stumbling, how much more will the Gentiles be blessed when Israel's fullness comes in, when Israel as a nation comes to faith? And then he makes the application of that purpose in verses 13 and 14. And notice Paul says that he is delighted in verse 13 that God called him to do Gentile evangelism. He is glad and happy that God called him to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Why is he happy? Is it because it's so much easier to witness to Gentiles than Jews? That may be so, but that's not the reason he gives. He's using a good type of rabbinic logic. I am delighted that God called me to do Gentile evangelism, because the more Gentiles I bring to faith, there'll be that many more Gentiles that can provoke Jews to jealousy, and therefore that many more Jews will also come to faith. That's good rabbinic logic. I like it. And so in verse 14, these Gentiles will lead Jewish people to saving faith by provoking them to jealousy. And so the purpose of Israel's stumbling was for Gentile salvation, and the purpose of Gentile salvation is for Jewish salvation. And this is the methodology by which God chooses to work. So the key purpose on the capital B is in verses 1 through 10, and that is to provoke Jews to jealousy so many will come to faith. And the program is that always be a remnant coming to faith. But the major way God brings members of the remnant to come to faith is by means of being provoked to jealousy. And that leads to the Gentile responsibility, which is to not to provoke Jews to anger, but to provoke them to jealousy. So notice both, let me make one more point. The way the Gentiles need to provoke Jews to jealousy is not merely by how they live. They have to present the gospel to them. Often in my travels, Gentiles come to me and say they're Jewish friends and Jewish neighbors, and so they're living a Christian lifestyle in front of them and waiting for them to be asked, what makes your life so different? And then we can share the gospel with them. And some of them have these Jewish friends for just a few months, but sometimes for years, and the Jew never asked them what makes you different. How we live must conform to what we believe. How we live must conform to what we believe. However, no one will get saved by how we live. There must be a presentation of the clear gospel message. Messiah died for your sin, he was buried and rose again, and that death alone must be trusted to receive eternal life. And that's the message that must be presented. There must be a verbal witness and not merely living a spiritual life. So in keeping with the book of Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8 and 9, notice both our purposes of Gentile salvation is connected with Jewish salvation. The second purpose is to provoke the Jews to jealousy, and this will lead to modern-day remnant salvation. But the other purpose, to take up among the Gentiles a people for his name, will ultimately lead to Israel's national salvation. And so there is both a present goal and a future goal for the purpose of Gentile salvation. Stila.